There's a little girl standing in the lobby, holding a letter. She insists on seeing the most important person here. And she says, "That's you." Callum Reed stopped typing. The words, coming through the receptionist's voice on the intercom, sounded like a strange Monday morning prank. He blinked at the computer screen, where market indexes flickered by the second. At this hour, anything unrelated to performance or assets automatically went into the "not urgent" category. "A kid?" he asked, his tone calm, almost indifferent. "Yes, about 6 years old, I'd say. No one's with her. I thought I should let you know." A brief silence. Then, decisively, "Have security handle it." But as his hand dropped toward the button to end the call, something inside him slowed down. He didn't know why. A flicker of hesitation, rare for a mind trained to make decisions as fast as an algorithm. A few seconds later, he called back. "If she's still there, just bring the letter up." Nothing in Callum's 42nd floor office suggested that it belonged to someone who once believed in something beautiful. No family photos, no plants, no art on the walls, only glass, from floor to ceiling, encasing the city outside like a miniature model. His desk was so neat it felt sterile. A single widescreen monitor, a cup of black coffee that was never touched, and a stone gray chair. Every morning, Callum sat there like part of a programmed routine. Log into the system, review capital rounds, answer emails, forecast cash flow, check a few charts. No sound. No people. No feelings. Years ago, there was a time he believed in things like the right person, the right time. He once spent an entire summer in New Hampshire just walking with a girl he thought he'd marry someday. But then silence, unexplained, absolute, took its place. And he learned to believe in something else. Numbers, data, the things that never disappeared on a rainy morning. 13 minutes later, Claire, his assistant, walked in, holding a white envelope with bent edges and an unsealed flap. "Handwritten letter," she said, placing it on his desk, "from the little girl downstairs." "Sender?" Callum asked, his hand still moving the mouse. "She said her mom told her to deliver it to you personally. No one else. It has to be you." Callum didn't look up. "Claire, I don't have time for sentimental Monday morning stories." "I know." Claire paused, then lowered her voice. "But the way she looked at me, you should read it." He looked up at her for the first time that morning. Claire wasn't someone who got easily shaken. She'd once faced an investor screaming about a lost $4 million deal and didn't even flinch. But now, her eyes carried something he couldn't quantify. After she left, Callum stared at the envelope on his desk. The handwriting on it was uneven, ink slightly smudged at the corner. No logo, no return address, just one line, written in purple ink. To Mr. Callum Reed, urgent and personal. His heart gave a small, involuntary jump. Callum reached for the letter. The paper felt softer than usual, worn thin from being handled too many times. He didn't open it right away, just held it. Outside, the city hummed beyond the thick glass. But inside, something in the silence began to shift. Not because of a phone ringing, not because of a financial report, because of a small envelope, and a little girl who refused to leave the lobby until it was delivered. Callum held the letter for a long while before opening it. Something in him resisted, not out of fear, but because as long as it stayed sealed, everything still felt contained, manageable, within his control. And then, almost automatically, he pulled the letter from the envelope. A single folded sheet, handwriting slightly slanted, ink uneven, some strokes faint, others heavy. No heading, no greeting. "Eliza is your daughter." His hand froze, eyes locked on the first line as if he'd misread it. But he hadn't. The words were there, clear, unmoving, indifferent to whether he believed them or not. "I don't have much time left. Let her know who her father is, before it's too late. Arden Walsh." He read those last 3 lines at least 3 times. That name, Arden, felt like an old wound ripped open. It had been 7 years since he'd heard it, spoken it, or even allowed himself to think it for more than a passing moment. Yet with just one signature, every mental wall he'd built came crashing down. A soft knock broke the silence. Claire peeked in and said quietly, "The girl's still here. I think maybe you should see her." Callum stayed silent for a few seconds, as if counting his own breaths. Then he stood up. The lobby wasn't crowded that morning, but there was still a steady flow of people passing through. Near the glass doors, the little girl sat neatly on a leather chair, still holding the now empty envelope. Her hair was tied unevenly, a few strands falling across her forehead. The white canvas shoes she wore were worn out, the stitching at the toes coming loose. But what made Callum stop in his tracks were her eyes. Not afraid, not timid, yet missing the innocent spark most 6-year-olds carried. Eliza looked up when she saw him. Without waiting for him to speak, she stood, straightened her posture, and said in a small but steady voice, "Mom said if I didn't give you the letter, it would be too late." The words hit him like a pin straight to the chest. Before he could respond, Eliza gave a small nod and turned away. No questions, no requests, no hesitation. The receptionist started toward her, offering to have someone stay with her until a guardian arrived. But Callum raised a hand. "Let her go." He stayed where he was, watching her small figure shrink beyond the glass doors. Something caught in his throat, a feeling both strange and painfully familiar. Then he returned to his office, closed the door, and sat down before the letter once more. Eliza is his daughter. Callum sank back into his chair, head tilted against the leather rest. The ceiling light cast its cold glow, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Everything in the letter was written as if it were fact. No pleading. No persuasion. No trace of bitterness. Just a statement, cold yet desperate, as if the writer had no choice left but to place the truth before him and let him decide whether to face it or not. He turned to his computer and typed Arden Walsh into the search bar. Nothing new came up. Just a few blurry old photos from a college club archive. A short post from an art society about a small performance she'd done in another state. No social media, no updates, no trace. She had vanished from the world the same way she'd vanished from his life. And yet today, a 6-year-old girl had walked into the building he'd built on control, cold logic, and precision, carrying a letter that shattered every boundary he thought was permanent. Callum rubbed his hands over his face. His palms felt colder than he expected. His eyes drifted to the untouched cup of coffee on his desk. The bitterness waiting in that cup couldn't wake him up nearly as much as the truth he'd just read. Eliza, 6 years old. If the letter was telling the truth, she was born less than a year after Arden disappeared. A year after the night he received that one photo, the one that made him cut everything off without a single question. Inside his head, 100 questions lined up in perfect order. Why didn't she tell him sooner? Why send the child instead of coming herself? Why choose this way, sudden, impossible, without warning? But every question slammed into the same wall. Eliza is his daughter. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in a very long while, Callum couldn't think of a single argument against what he'd just read. He folded the paper but didn't set it down. His thumb traced the signature at the bottom, as if his brain hadn't yet caught up to what his eyes had seen, and his senses needed to verify it through touch, not reason. Arden Walsh. That signature was like a sharp hook, tearing open memories he thought he'd locked away behind layers of cold steel in his mind. That name, 3 simple syllables, carried an entire chapter of his life he'd chosen to erase. Almost 7 years ago, when everything was simpler, when he still believed he wouldn't become the man he was now. The man who lived by the clock, measured life by checklists, and avoided any feeling that might make him stop. Arden wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She studied fine arts, renting a small room on the 3rd floor of the campus dorms, while he majored in software engineering and lived near the library. They met in an elective class on visual culture, a course Callum had no interest in but was forced to take to meet his graduation credits. On the very first day, Arden had joked, "If you don't understand art, just look at the light. It'll lead you to the feeling before you have time to analyze it." That line, naive as it sounded, was somehow the truest description of how she lived. No calculations, no plans. Arden did everything by instinct and left behind small trails of chaos wherever she went, painting and forgetting to pay rent, biking across the park to chase the perfect sunset but showing up late for dinner, forgetting birthdays but remembering every quiet sadness Callum had never spoken aloud. They were together for 3 years, intense, messy, and completely opposite. He helped her remember deadlines, she helped him forget time. In their final year of college, they talked about finding a place to rent together after graduation. He'd even planned to propose during their fall trip to Oregon. But then came the email. A photo, no message. Arden sitting in the lap of a man he didn't recognize. The man's arm around her waist, her chin resting on his shoulder, both of them smiling. It wasn't a fleeting moment caught by chance. It wasn't the kind of misunderstanding one could forgive. Callum hadn't asked questions. He hadn't called. He hadn't texted. He just closed his laptop, erased every future plan from his mind, and vanished from the relationship as if it had never existed. She never called either. Never explained. and he took that silence as final proof that he hadn't mattered as much as he'd believed. Arden had always lived by emotion, so maybe she'd left the same way, by feeling. That was it. It took him 6 months of burying himself in work to forget what it felt like to stay up all night painting with her on the dorm walls. A year later, his first startup was acquired by a corporation. 3 years later, he was a rising name in tech investment. For 7 years, no one had spoken the name Arden Walsh, and he believed he had buried her in a closed chapter, one he'd never turn back to again. And yet here it was, her name resurfacing, not in memory, but in reality, delivered by the hands of a child she claimed was his. Callum rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the city slowly swallowed by fog below. He couldn't stop his mind from calculating. If Eliza was 6, Arden must have gotten pregnant just a few months after he'd disappeared from her life, which meant she'd carried the baby, given birth, and raised her alone, all without telling him a word. The only thing he felt now was chaos, not pain, not anger, just a kind of invisible helplessness. He was the one who'd chosen silence, the one who'd cut things off, the one who'd never left space for anyone to explain. He had walked away before he even knew the truth. But sending a child to his office? No warning, no appointment, no message, just a handwritten letter? Why? Why not come herself? Why send a 6-year-old? Why now, when he no longer believed in any kind of relationship at all? Callum pressed a hand to his forehead. Everything he thought he'd forgotten had turned into new questions. No data, no numbers, nothing to analyze, only a past he thought he'd left behind. And the name he believed he'd never hear again was now the only thing occupying his mind. The next morning, Callum drove to the hospital address written on the back of the letter. It was a private oncology center tucked away in a quiet residential area, its entrance paved with gray stone, hallways washed in a pale yellow glow, spotless, almost sterile. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't made an appointment. He came simply because not coming wasn't an option. The nurse at the reception desk looked at him as if she'd been expecting him. When he said the name Arden Walsh, she gave a small nod, asked nothing, and led him to the elevator. Pressing the button for the 3rd floor. Last room at the end of the hall, she said. The door isn't locked. Callum walked slowly. The corridor was so silent that each step echoed like it was striking inside his head. His heartbeat was off rhythm, heavy, uneven. He didn't know what he was about to see, didn't know what he would say. Only that after this moment, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. A faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. The room was simple. One hospital bed, a padded chair, a small window looking out onto a pale, hazy sky. Arden lay on her side, eyes closed, an IV line in her arm. Half of her hair had been shaved, the rest tied neatly back. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, her cheeks hollow. But when her eyes opened, they were still those eyes. Callum froze. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly, not surprised. I thought you wouldn't come, Arden whispered. He nodded, his voice low. I thought so too. The space between them felt heavy as stone. Neither stepped closer, neither sat down. No tears, no anger. Just two people who had once collided like a storm, now standing in the wreckage, unsure where to begin. I read the letter, Callum said, eyes fixed on her face. I figured you did. It's true? His voice was rough, almost breaking. Arden nodded slowly. Eliza is your daughter. Callum exhaled, long, uneven. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, his fingers interlaced, palms cold and empty. The man in the photo, he began. My roommate, Arden interrupted softly. He came out a few months later. He lives in Portland now, with 2 rescue dogs. Callum closed his eyes. Part of him wanted to laugh at the cruel simplicity of that truth. Another part wanted to punch himself for never asking. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. Not accusing, just trying to understand. You didn't ask, Arden said, her gaze drifting toward the window. I thought you. Callum swallowed hard. I thought you'd chosen someone else, so I left. I know. She paused for a moment. And I didn't have the strength to chase after you, Callum. Back then, I thought if you believed I'd betrayed you, maybe it would be easier for you to forget me. When did you find out you were pregnant? He asked quietly. About 2 months after you disappeared, Arden said quietly. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to tell you, then I couldn't. Every time I picked up the phone to call, I'd hang up again. I thought you'd already made your choice. I didn't want to make you feel trapped. You thought I wouldn't stay, he said, half question, half echo of her thought. Yes, I thought you'd hate me, hate her. I was afraid of that. Silence settled between them. Outside the window, a gust of wind rattled the glass, carrying with it a few dry leaves that spiraled out of sight. "I never thought about having kids," Callum said softly. "Never thought I could be a father. But when Eliza stood there, in my company lobby, I wasn't sure of anything anymore." Arden smiled, a faint glimmer of the old warmth flickering in eyes dulled by medication. "She's my everything, Callum, the reason I've endured every round of treatment. But I know I don't have much time left." Callum clenched his fists. "Don't say that. I'm not saying it for pity," Arden murmured. "I'm saying it because I don't want to leave her without knowing who her father is. I made one mistake. I don't want to keep making it." He stood, moving closer to the bed. He didn't touch her, just stood near enough to feel her breath. "Thank you for sending the letter," he said quietly. "Even if it's too late. Better late than never." For the first time in 7 years, their eyes met without hesitation. No one left to blame, nothing left to explain. Just one chance, so small it barely existed, yet somehow still worth holding on to. 3 days after the hospital visit, Callum still hadn't managed to return to his usual rhythm. Claire had postponed or canceled everything on his schedule. He sat in his office doing nothing, no meetings, no approvals, no report checks. The folder with the week's data remained unopened. He stared at a revenue chart, his mind completely blank. Near noon, the desk phone rang. He hadn't planned to answer, but his hand moved on instinct. "Callum, it's me, Devon." That voice, familiar, too familiar. Devon had been his first assistant, his closest friend, and the co-founder of his first company. They'd built it together from a rundown garage. Callum had once trusted him like family until Devon walked away 2 years ago, claiming he needed a new challenge. Since then, they'd barely spoken, exchanging only polite messages on the rare occasion that required it. "I heard some people talking about you yesterday," Devon said after a pause. "Seems like you've been quieter than usual lately." Another pause. "Word is, a little girl showed up at your office?" Callum didn't answer right away. That wasn't public information. Claire was discreet, and the letter, no one outside the office should have known about it. "Devon," he said carefully, "why are you calling?" "Just curious, that's all." The name Arden, it's been a long time since I've heard it. Quite a surprise. Devon gave a small laugh. The sound was odd, unsettling, enough to send a chill crawling up Callum's spine. "You know about the letter?" Callum asked, his tone slowing, tightening. "I can guess," Devon said lightly. "Honestly, I always figured that would resurface eventually. You know how it is. No secret stays buried forever." Callum's grip on the phone tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Devon was silent for a beat, just long enough for the air to thicken, before he said, almost as if the words had been burning inside him, "That photo back then, I sent it." The room seemed to lose all its oxygen. Callum rose from his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Why?" His voice came out rough, broken. Devon exhaled. "I didn't think you'd care that much. I thought I was protecting you. Back then, Arden, she wasn't right for you. You were blind to it, and He paused, his tone tightening. "I was the one who saw the risks you couldn't." Callum said nothing, didn't even breathe. The question in his head wasn't why, it was how did I not see it sooner? "You loved her," Callum said finally, his voice flat, almost empty, as if naming something that had always been true. Devon didn't deny it. "I never had a chance. She never looked at me the way she looked at you. So I did what I had to make you see things clearly." Callum closed his eyes. A memory surfaced. The moment he received that email with the photo. He'd noticed the unfamiliar address, but he hadn't cared enough to question it. He'd been too hurt to think. And Devon had been the first to show up at his door, beer in hand, listening to him talk through the pain, nodding like a loyal friend. But the truth was, he'd been there the whole time, pouring fuel on a wound Callum hadn't even realized was open. "You didn't just steal 7 years from me," Callum said slowly. "You stole the chance for me to be her father from the very beginning." Devon said nothing. There was nothing left to defend. "Don't ever call me again." Callum hung up before another word could reach him. He stood there, drained, as if something vital had been pulled out of his body. He didn't know which hurt more, the betrayal by the one person he'd trusted most, or realizing that he'd chosen to believe the lie himself. He was the one who left, the one who cut it all off. But he'd done it because of a truth that never existed. 7 years. He had lost 7 years of a child's life, his child's life, without even knowing it. No birthdays, no first day of school photos, No bedtime stories whispered in the dark. All of it had already happened, and he could never get it back. Callum walked to the glass wall, staring out at the city rushing along its usual rhythm, every person moving with purpose while his world stood still. Somewhere out there was a little girl who carried his name. Maybe doodling on a piece of paper. Maybe asking her mother why the sky had clouds. He used to think he understood what loss meant. But today, he finally knew what it felt like to lose everything. Callum submitted the DNA sample on Monday morning at a discreet private clinic in the suburbs. He used a false name, paid in cash, and requested complete confidentiality. No public records, no system links, no one aware except him and the lab. The technician wore gloves and didn't ask a single question. Everything was quick, precise, clinical, exactly the way Callum had lived his life. But this time, when he signed the sealed envelope, his hand trembled slightly. "How long for the results?" he asked. 3 to 5 business days, the technician replied. Callum nodded without another word. He left the clinic and stepped into the sunlight as if he'd just finished a kind of mental surgery. Now all he could do was wait. The waiting stretched longer than he'd expected. For the first time in years, time wasn't measured by meetings or data files. It was measured by moments he couldn't control. He couldn't sit still, couldn't work, and instead of forcing himself back into the familiar machinery of routine, he did something no one would have predicted. He went to pick Eliza up from school. Arden had given him the school's address during their hospital meeting. A small private kindergarten tucked in a quiet neighborhood. The first day he showed up, the teacher looked at him with mild suspicion, but after confirming with Eliza's mother, she smiled and said, "She's in the backyard." Callum stepped into the small brick-paved yard where children were playing hide-and-seek among low hedges and pastel slides. He spotted Eliza almost instantly. She was crouched under a wooden table, coloring on a sheet of paper with a wax crayon. Her hair was tied high to one side, a few strands falling across her cheek. Her eyes were fixed on her drawing, lips pursed in deep concentration. The way she tilted her head, the slight pout when she was thinking, it made Callum freeze. He'd made that exact same expression countless times while coding, when he was trying to solve a problem, decode an algorithm, back when he was young, and still believed that the right lines of code could fix everything broken in life. Eliza looked up when his shadow fell across her drawing. She squinted for a moment, then smiled. "You're the man from the tall building, right?" "Yes, that's me." Callum nodded. "Did you come to pick me up?" "If you'd like me to." Eliza gave a small, thoughtful nod, then stood clutching her unfinished drawing. On the page was a blue house, a tree, and 3 figures. A woman with yellow hair, a little girl, and a man in a suit. "Who's this?" Callum asked, pointing at the man. "I think that's the dad," Eliza said simply, as if it were just a label, not a person. They walked toward the car together. Eliza didn't ask many questions, just glanced at him now and then, as though quietly studying him, trying to match something familiar. When they finally sat inside the car, she turned to him, tilting her head, her voice soft and curious. "Are you Mommy's friend? Or someone else?" Callum looked straight ahead through the windshield. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to say. Didn't want to lie, but couldn't tell her the truth until he knew for sure. So he turned to her with a gentle smile. "We're just getting to know each other, aren't we?" Eliza nodded, accepting that answer, and didn't ask again. The 5th day the results arrived, a thick sealed envelope delivered by hand to his office. Claire didn't ask a word, just placed it on his desk and quietly left. Callum stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before touching it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he tore it open, each rip precise and merciless. Blue ink on white paper. A clear header, paternity analysis report. The final line bolded. Probability of biological relationship, father-child, 99.99%. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. His whole body felt pulled into a quiet void. Not from shock, but from a soft kind of pain, the kind that comes when the truth finally speaks for itself. That afternoon, he went back to pick up Eliza from school. The rain had just stopped. The sidewalks were still wet. Eliza came running toward him, shoes muddy, hair a little messy. "Did you finish your drawing?" he asked. "I did. I added a dog, but I haven't named it yet." "We can think of one together," he said. Eliza smiled, a small tilted smile with a tiny dimple appearing on one cheek. Callum froze, that smile. He'd seen it in the mirror all his life. His mother used to tease him about it whenever he pretended he hadn't done anything wrong. There was no mistaking it. Without thinking, he knelt down and opened his arms. Eliza hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Neither of them said a word. In the schoolyard, softened by the fading afternoon light, he just held her, long and tight. No one else mattered, no title needed. He was her father, and she was his daughter. 3 days after the results came in, Callum sent an internal email to Claire at 6 a.m. It contained only one line: cancel all appointments until further notice. No reason, no timeline, no delegation. Claire didn't ask, she simply followed orders as always. But this time, her eyes held something between suspicion and quiet relief. That afternoon, Callum returned to the old hospital where Arden was still being treated. He went straight to administration, handed over a stack of papers, transfer forms, private insurance information, and then walked to her room. "Tomorrow we're moving you," he said firmly. "The new place has better doctors, better equipment. You don't have to worry about anything." Arden started to protest, but he raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not doing this out of obligation," he said, voice steady. "I'm doing it because I should have been here from the start." His gaze was unwavering, and for once, Arden had no words left to argue. The new treatment center sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by rows of maple trees and open fields of grass. Quiet, peaceful, nothing like the sterile chaos of the old hospital. The patient rooms weren't blindingly white, but painted in warm tones, each with a window overlooking a small garden where patients could walk when they felt strong enough. Callum personally chose the room with the most sunlight. He had a small sofa added for Eliza, and a few framed pictures hung on the wall, so Arden wouldn't feel like just another patient in the middle of another treatment. All the costs were covered under his name, paid through a newly created private fund called Letters Before Goodbye. No one knew about it except him and a single legal advisor. There was no website, no social media, no press release. The fund had one purpose only: to help single mothers with terminal illnesses fulfill the one thing they wanted most before the end. Whether it was writing a final letter, seeing someone one last time, or taking their child to watch the snow fall for the very first time. Callum did everything quietly. No media, no recognition, no association with his name. To him, this wasn't about inspiration or image building. It was the first thing in his life he'd ever done without calculating ROI or setting a deadline. It was simply something that needed to be done. Eliza came to the hospital every afternoon after school. She carried a small backpack filled with drawing paper, a box of crayons, and sometimes a stuffed animal. She'd become so familiar with the nurses that they let her through the ward without asking her name. Arden always smiled when the little girl walked in, even on days when she was too weak to keep her eyes open for long. One afternoon, Callum arrived earlier than usual. He stopped outside the room and peered through the small glass panel in the door. Eliza was sitting in a chair beside the bed, telling her mother a rambling story about a classmate who'd spilled a carton of milk on his own head. Arden was giggling, shoulders trembling softly. Eliza laughed too, but her voice stayed gentle, as if afraid to tire her mother. Callum didn't go in right away. He stood there, watching the two of them, and the quiet space beside them. It was a small, still moment, but so deep he didn't dare break it. That night, he sat in his small home office under the soft glow of a desk lamp. On the table lay the files for Letters Before Goodbye. He was reviewing the fund's first 2 cases. One, a 29-year-old mother who wanted to take her child back to the town where she grew up to say goodbye to her parents. The other, a woman who simply wished for one good photo with her 2 kids before chemotherapy took all her hair. Callum signed each file. His hand didn't tremble. For the first time in his life, his signature carried no pressure, no terms, no hidden expectation. Another afternoon, while Eliza was drawing in the waiting room, Callum sat beside her, watching her color a picture of an elephant wearing a pink dress. Eliza looked up and held out the drawing. "This is Mommy. This is me. And this is Daddy," she said, pointing to the 3 main figures. "Daddy's in the middle, because Mommy says he's the one who keeps us from blowing away in the wind." Callum's throat tightened. He looked at the drawing. Himself, a tall figure with arms spread wide, shielding the 2 beside him. There was no face, only a shape. But maybe for Eliza, that was enough. Arden grew weaker with each passing week, yet her spirit never slipped into despair. Callum stayed beside her through every IV drip, every bandage change. Eliza would climb onto the bed, tell stories, draw new pictures, and tape them to the hospital wall just to make her mother smile. One afternoon, when a nurse gently suggested Eliza step outside so Arden could rest, the little girl turned to Callum and whispered, "Daddy, can you stay with Mommy?" Callum only nodded. He couldn't bring himself to speak. In that room washed with soft light, he no longer felt like the man who'd built a company from nothing. Not the man who managed everything by logic, not the CEO, not the investor. He was just a man, doing things he'd never done before, but the only two people in the world who could make him do them. The fourth week at the treatment center began with a change so small, no one had dared to hope for it. The latest test results showed that Arden's tumor had started to shrink. The experimental drug, the one her doctors had suggested as a final option, was actually working. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a cure. But it meant time. And for people who had already accepted loss, time alone was enough to reignite hope. Callum was there every day. He read medical journals like a final-year med student, asking detailed questions about every metric, every side effect. Arden laughed and teased him for making everything sound so serious, but he didn't laugh back. To him, nothing was small when it had to do with the person he had almost lost forever. Eliza felt the change too. Her mother no longer gasped for breath every time she sat up. In the mornings, the little girl began bringing extra coloring books to the hospital room, and the three of them would sit together on the bed, each with a page of their own. Callum learned to color along the edges first, strictly following Eliza's detailed artistic instructions, before filling in the middle. One Saturday morning, Claire texted him. The office had received a letter from the very first recipient of the Letters Before Goodbye Fund. It included a photo and a short note of thanks. The mother had managed to take her son to the ocean before her final treatment began. Callum read the message and couldn't find words. He simply forwarded the photo to Arden. She placed a hand on her chest, took a slow breath, and smiled. That afternoon, while Eliza played with the hospital's fountain spray in the courtyard, Arden called Callum over. "I don't know how much time I have left," she said softly, "but I feel enough, because she has you. And this time, I know I don't have to do everything alone." Callum took her hand. No promises, no grand words. They didn't live by promises anymore. They lived by moments, real, fragile, and happening right now. Sunday morning, Arden was strong enough to go down to the cafeteria. A nurse pushed her wheelchair. Eliza carried a tray of pancakes, and Callum brought coffee for all three. They sat at a table by the window, sunlight slanting through the plastic cups, and turning the tabletop into a sheet of gold. Eliza ate as she talked about her dream from the night before. In it, she was a superhero who could fly, and Callum was stuck on the roof because he was afraid of heights. Callum laughed, shaking his head. That would never happen. Eliza tilted her head, watching him. Then, without hesitation, without shyness or ceremony, she said, "Dad, if I had superpowers, I'd make you not scared of anything." Callum looked up. He didn't respond right away. He just met her eyes and nodded slowly. That word, Dad, wasn't something anyone had told her to say. It wasn't taught or suggested or rehearsed. It came naturally, as if it had always existed somewhere between them, just waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. After Eliza ran off to the playground, Callum reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, worn piece of folded paper. The edges were frayed, the color faded to a soft yellow. He unfolded it and laid it on the table. Arden leaned closer. It was the letter. He began to read it slowly, as if each word required air to exist. "Eliza is your daughter. I don't have much time left. Let her know who her father is before it's too late." Arden looked down, her eyes glistening. Callum folded the letter again and slipped it back into his wallet. "I keep it," he said quietly, "to remind myself that this time I have to get it right." A week later, the weather shifted. The sky turned an impossibly clear blue. The air was warm enough to go outside without a coat. The doctors allowed Arden to leave the ward for a little while, as long as someone went with her. The three of them chose the park behind the treatment center. Eliza brought her small bike, the one Callum had just fitted with training wheels. She rode in circles along the brick path, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon in the air. Arden sat on a bench, one hand resting on her stomach, her eyes never leaving her daughter. Callum stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, eyes following Eliza. A soft breeze slipped through his shirt, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the faint sweetness of pastries from a nearby food cart. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stood still this long, or the last time he'd felt something like this. A quiet peace that didn't need a reason. Eliza circled around twice. Then on the third lap stopped abruptly in front of them. "Mom, Dad, look at me," she shouted. Callum laughed, turning toward Arden. She looked back at him, saying nothing. But in that silence, everything was clear. They were back, at the right place, in the right moment, with the right people. He sat down beside her, their shoulders brushing. Eliza rode off again, this time farther, steadier. Arden spoke softly, her gaze fixed ahead. "I don't know how long this will last," Callum answered. "No one ever really does, but we have it, right now. And sometimes, right now is enough." He reached for her hand. Eliza turned around and grinned, her hair wild in the wind, sunlight breaking through it like light through water. There was no need for a distant future, no need for long promises. Just that moment, whole, real, untouched by anything else. And for the first time in years, Callum felt his heart as light as the late autumn sun. No distance, no regret, only the present. And the two people he loved most, right there with him. Sometimes a single letter can open the door to an entire life once missed. Not all of us get a second chance, but if there's still time to love, to make things right, to say I'm here now, then that's not an ending. It's a beginning. Have you ever lost someone just because of silence? If you could write one letter to the person you once walked away from, what would you say? If this story made you pause, even for a few seconds, to think of someone in your own life, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reach the quietest corners of the heart. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.